Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen.
And my name is Katie. And we want to spend a few minutes a day with you walking through the New Testament, one chapter at a time. This year, we will fix our gaze upon Christ so that we may know him, not only with our minds, but with our hearts.
Together, we will learn that who Jesus is changes everything.
Hi friends, welcome back to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Katie, and together we are walking through the New Testament in a year. Currently, we are studying 1 Corinthians, and today we will be in 1 Corinthians 4. As always, you can follow along with the Behold studies in the Daily Grace Co shop or the reading plan linked in the show notes. Yesterday, Paul rebuked the Corinthians for allowing worldly matters to create division within the church. The Corinthians were divided in preference of teacher. Some preferred Paul, others preferred Apollos, still some Peter. They likely judged the leaders based on how we would judge teachers: passion, looks, respectability, eloquence. But Paul reminds them that teachers of the word are not celebrities to be praised. They're servants of the true Lord. They have given their lives not for their own glory, but to give Christ glory. Paul continues the servant metaphor today. What's ironic and so beautiful about today's chapter is that while the Corinthians are judging teachers based on their strengths, Paul magnifies his weakness. He is not living to please the Corinthians. Paul says in verse 3 that it is of little importance to me that I should be judged by you or any human court. Paul knows it is God who judges him, and therefore he has no need to fear the opinion of man. For a girl who spends way too much time thinking about others' opinions, this challenges me. How would my boldness to share the gospel increase if I wasn't hindered by the fear of man? I'm sure I'm not alone. I think we all could learn from Paul here. We can lay aside our fear of man because God is our ultimate judge. We live to please him and not others. So what does Paul care about instead? Paul cares about being found faithful, as he says in verse 2. Jesus' parable of the talents is helpful to consider here, to help us understand what Paul is saying. In Matthew 25, 14 through 30, Jesus tells a parable about a man who is preparing for a journey. While he's gone, he entrusts talents or money of different amounts to 3 different servants. Their job is to manage what they've been given well. The first uses 5 talents he has to earn 5 more talents. The second uses 2 talents he's been given to earn 2 more. And finally, the third, who has been given 1, buries the talent because he's too afraid to lose it. He was fearful of his master and what repercussions might be if he lost it. The first 2 servants receive a "well done, good and faithful servant" from the master. But the last servant, he's called evil and lazy. The first 2 servants were faithful to what the master entrusted. The last was found unfaithful. Paul wants to be found faithful, to have stewarded well what God has given to him, just as the faithful servants did in Jesus' parable. The question remains for us: are we being faithful to what God has entrusted us with? At the end of the age, it is God who will judge our effort. He will bring light to what is hidden in darkness and reveal the intentions of the heart. Paul calls the Corinthians to stop judging prematurely. Part of this is that they were judging Paul for his weakness in teaching. See, Paul discerns arrogance at the heart of the Corinthian believers. They were judging Paul and other teachers as if they themselves had no flaws or room to grow. Paul uses sarcasm here and says, "Who makes you so superior?" Or in modern day terms, "Who do you think you are?" They judge as if they are already kings. They already run the race and finished well. Sarcastically, Paul says that he wishes that that were the case, so that he would too reign with them. But that's not the case. There's still a lot of work to be done, even in the heart of the Corinthians. Paul is calling them to lay aside their pride and judgment and follow the example of the apostles, who demonstrate Christ's upside-down kingdom. While the Corinthians are arguing what teacher they liked better, the apostles were being made a spectacle of the world. They are hungry and thirsty, poorly clothed, roughly treated, homeless, hard workers, reviled, persecuted, and slandered. Paul says that they are like the scum of the earth. Paul is living according to Jesus' words in Matthew 16:25. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life because of me will find it. The apostles are modeling what it means to follow in Christ's footsteps, who loved his church enough to die for her. This is the humility Paul calls us to serve as Christ has served us, to love as Christ has loved us. Again, Paul declares the love he has for this church. Yes, they are in need of correction, but he corrects them as a loving father corrects his child, shepherding them for their good. Paul says his intent in writing is not to bring shame. He calls them to imitate him as he imitates Christ. Paul's weakness and humility prove his credibility rather than refute it. For even Christ humbled himself and experienced weakness for our sake. To provide the Corinthians with an example of humility, Paul sends Timothy to minister to them until Paul can visit himself. And we know that Paul does visit again, for in 2 Corinthians, Paul refers to a painful visit that likely happened between 1 and 2 Corinthians. One thing we do know, Paul loves this church too much to leave them in their spiritual infancy. He desires them to grow in their love and knowledge of God. And that means putting aside the attitudes of the world and putting on the attitude of Christ, who did not consider equality with God something to be exploited, but humbled himself even to the point of death, as Philippians 2 says. If Christ, the King of Kings, assumed the role of a servant, how much more should we? Behold Christ as the only one worthy of boasting, and yet he chose humility. For his obedience, he is now highly exalted in heaven with the name above every name. So too, when he returns in power and glory, he will exalt those who follow in his footsteps. May we take Paul's words to heart, lay aside our pride, and steward our lives well, keeping our focus on pleasing the Master when he returns.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. Don't forget to check out the show notes for helpful links and resources related to today's episode. And make sure you are following at Daily Grace Podcast on Instagram for more A Year in the Bible content, and at the Daily Grace Co. for all things Bible study resources. We can't wait to study again with you tomorrow. Bye, friends.